Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? How are y'all doing today? Super excited to be here for open source and education this week. How's everyone's open source global hack week going so far? Looks like we have a lot of people from kind of all over. Some people from Canada, India, some more from India, some people from the EU, Nigeria. Awesome. It looks like we have a lot of excitement. So let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about open source and education and kind of how it can revolutionize EdTech. There's a lot of different possibilities for open source to be used in education, kind of like outside of EdTech as well, but kind of to help teachers and educators with more like open source and kind of collaborative curriculum. So it's kind of like super exciting, all the possibilities. So kind of a little bit of an overview of everything we'll be doing today. First of all, we're going to start off with a quick introduction into kind of like what open source is, a little bit about education technology, and then we're kind of going to go into a little bit of a comparison of open source EdTech versus proprietary open tech and kind of the benefits and drawbacks of both of them. And then finally, we'll be talking a little bit about implementing open source and kind of like how that works in the educational field. After that, we're going to get into kind of applying what we learned throughout this whole stream, and we'll do some case studies where we talk about implementing open source in education and kind of what you need to consider, the challenges and successes of that. And then at the very end, we'll have some time for questions. If you have any thoughts you want to share on what you learned throughout the presentation, you can feel free to share those as well. And also, if you want to go back and look at these slides at any time, you can go to this bit.ly link on screen. It's just bit.ly/GHW-EdTech, and then you'll be able to pull up my slides. Awesome. Okay, so let's kind of get started. My name is Gabriella. I'm from Major League Hacking. I work as a coach here at Major League Hacking. So when I'm not streaming at Global Hack Week, I go to different hackathons that partner with Major League Hacking. And I'm kind of interested in all things at the intersection of tech and social sciences. I find it to be super interesting to learn just kind of about how technology can be integrated into so many different areas of the world. Yes, so now we're going to kind of dive into an introduction to open source as a whole. I don't know how much y'all have attended kind of the other streams and how much you know about open source. So I figured this would be kind of a good way for all of us to kind of come in on like an equal understanding. The link to my slides is bit.ly/GHW-EdTech, but I'll also have a link at the end of the presentation if you want to go back later as well. So a little bit about open source, kind of the principles of open source that are like really important to it are transparency, collaboration, and licensing. Kind of how transparency is important is because the source code of open source is like open to everyone and accessible to everyone. So if you notice that something is off, or there's a bug, that you're able to go in and fix it. And also it's for like more of that transparency of how does this thing work? And kind of like being able to monitor things like data security, data privacy, as well as just like how the application works and who the application is serving. A little bit more about collaboration, the second principle. This is a very key part of open source because there's no like one central entity controlling the open source application or project. It's very based in the collaboration of a community. It's typically developers and occasionally users, and the people who are accessing this application will all work together to kind of make improvements to this application. as well as to kind of make sure that the upkeep and maintenance of this application is going smoothly because it's not run by some central organization, institution. You need to have that community in place to make sure that the open source project continues to stay afloat and that everything is like running smoothly. And additionally, kind of like the final and like one of the key principles of open source is licensing. If you've ever been on GitHub or something similar and you've seen things like the MIT license or another license listed at the bottom, those are kind of licenses that people working on open source projects list. You're able to see kind of like how that technology can be used and how you can share that if possible. Some people like kind of are like open to using it, however, and they're just kind of like having that license down below to talk a little bit more about how like it's just like okay for you to kind of like you like, use this or edit it however you want. Some people want you to like not be editing their source code, but you can use it if it's like not for profit. Some people are okay with you editing it, but take no responsibility for it and don't want you to be using it for profit. So it just kind of depends on whoever's creating the open source application. And that'll be typically listed on the bottom of a GitHub page or wherever the open source project is being hosted. Kind of diving in a little bit more to the benefits of open source. The biggest is that it's cost effective. So if you're working with a small organization or a school, and schools are often underfunded, there's no licensing fees like there are with proprietary software. Occasionally, you'll have to pay someone to like upkeep like the customization of the open source at your institution, but that's almost always cheaper than like bringing in a proprietary data source. And then occasionally, you'll also have to pay for potentially integration to different proprietary software, like in conjunction with open source. But again, that's almost always cheaper than using proprietary software for whatever you're trying to do. Additionally, the customization that you're able to do, like you're able to integrate with open source technology is kind of amazing. You have like a lot of flexibility to tailor that application specifically to your needs as well as like your organization's specific needs. So for example, if you're working at a school and you have very specific needs for your classroom and then the needs for the school as a whole are different with open source, you're able to kind of adjust those as needed. And also the community support that comes along with open source is awesome. It not only you have that community of developers, like when you're trying to edit things or customize them, you have those people to ask questions to if you get confused or need help brainstorming. It's also a really great way to kind of like, it's a really great way for you to just like learn more about the software and like what it's capable of because you're able to connect with other developers who utilize open source technology in different ways and kind of brainstorm about like how it's even possible to integrate and customize for your organization. And then also, as kind of like the last benefit I'm going to highlight of open source is that the transparency of open source often leads to enhanced security. There's no kind of like there's not like the specific interest of like a corporation or like a larger institution that can lead to different things being prioritized over data security. And also, if you see a bug with data security, you're able to kind of adjust that when you're working through the different aspects of customizing your open source technology. Okay, I'm gonna look through and see if there's any questions so far. Awesome, okay. Kind of like a quick definition of open source as a whole, it's software, hardware, or content that is allowed to be released with a license that allows anyone to view, use, modify, and distribute it freely. Kind of as we talked about earlier, the different licenses for open source projects will kind of vary, but this is kind of like a general overview at like the like most free license, you kind of have carte blanche to do whatever you like with that software. Hardware, the content, you kind of want to adjust it, edit it to your needs, and then other places you're able to just reuse it. You're able to reuse it like, without using it in any sort of business sense, and kind of goes like from like that whole gamut. And a few examples of different open source softwares are Linux, Apache, as well as Mozilla Firefox, which are all some pretty cool applications. As far as hardware, there's the Open Compute Project, also known as OCP, as an open source hardware. Arduino, if you've ever used that, as well as Raspberry Pi. I know we sometimes have those hardware pieces at our hackathons. And kind of some content you might be familiar with. If you've ever been online, as Wikipedia is one of the most notorious open source kind of like pieces of content. People will be editing the different articles, kind of back checking one another. Sometimes it can lead to chaos if the people peer reviewing something aren't super knowledgeable about it, but it always tends to get fixed in the long run. Um, and then kind of a key piece that's more relevant to today is the open educational resources, OER, which is a lot of like open source educational content for curriculum that sometimes teachers and educators use. Someone's asking, what do licenses exactly do? So this is just license people will add to their open source projects to kind of specify how a piece of software, hardware, or content can be distributed, reused, and kind of like applied to your day-to-day life. It'll kind of like vary from you have the ability to do essentially whatever you want with it to we have like you can reuse this just in like specific situations essentially. And if we have time at the end, I can dive a little bit more into different licenses. I did not include a slide on that, which is maybe my bad for overlooking that, but yes, it's a pretty key part of open source. If there's no license listed, is the software licensed? So officially it's not licensed, but if there's no license listed, it's pretty good to assume that you can just use it in specific ways, use it for reference. And if you have any specific questions about that piece of software, it's probably a good idea to reach out to the creator and see if they have any wishes about it, rather than just assuming that it's okay to use it however you like. So kind of moving past the introduction to open source and diving a little bit more into education, which is why we're all here today. So kind of the importance of education technology might seem simple, but there's a lot of aspects about it that you might not think about. My mom was actually a teacher for a long time, so her explaining like a lot of how education technology has been used and is used now is really interesting to me because it varies so much by school as well as like what you're teaching. Kind of the important aspects of education technology is because it allows teachers and students to like modernize their material at a very rapid iterative pace. Because like as technology is like rapidly expanding, there's like things are changing very quickly, as I'm sure all of you know. So a lot of times it can be difficult for curriculum to keep up with that, especially for a school where they have like daily lessons on things. It's just difficult for like that amount of education to be up to date and able to iterate it quickly. But with education technology and things being stored digitally, as well as using like artificial intelligence and things like that to kind of like scrape new information and add it into your lesson plans, like that's like a really cool like innovation that can be made to keep people up to date, as well as like directly applying your curriculum and your lessons into like modern day. Additionally, EdTech can foster a lot of engagement, collaboration, and interactive learning. I don't know if any of you have been in a class where it's just like you're reading like a like very outdated textbook and kind of like being quizzed on the facts and that. And that's like the extent of your class, but it's not very interactive. And I feel like every time I've had a class like that, I just kind of like forget the information immediately. But with when technology is incorporated, even if it's in like a biology class or something that you wouldn't think is directly correlated to technology, I feel like I'm a lot more engaged when we have pieces that are more hands-on, even if they're not able to be like in person, like doing like a dissection or things like that. But technology has the ability to kind of make things more interactive and like allow for more collaboration between different students and also students at different schools that wasn't possible before. And then also a very key and exciting part of education and technology is that you're able to accommodate like a lot of different learning styles and needs. In the past, teachers and educators often had to kind of stick to one or two types of learning styles and needs just because they didn't have the bandwidth to accommodate a bunch of different education styles within their classroom, with there just being like one teacher and like 20, 30, 40 students. But with technology, it kind of allows for teachers to have like a greater variety of learning styles met. You're able to incorporate visual, audio, as well as like text-based learning a lot simpler because you're able to integrate all these pieces into something like a PowerPoint or your lesson plan, or you're able to have more interactive pieces because you're finding like a directly applicable digital lab like online that you're able to kind of connect with your students. And kind of like building off of this, I think it allows for a lot more accessibility in technology and a lot more accessibility in education than it did before. Because if you think of things like screen readers, and like kind of like the ability to adjust colors on screens that like didn't exist before technology or digital technology a little bit more specifically. And these are all tools that a lot of people need to kind of make their education more accessible and more understandable in the day to day. And a lot of times it makes that education faster because they have those necessary combinations. So it's really exciting that technology is able to provide that for people that need it. Kind of diving a little bit more into how EdTech is so important and incorporating technology is so important is the tech skills and digital literacy it provides for students. I don't know if you've ever um, been working with someone who isn't super adept with technology, but sometimes you'll have to kind of like educate people about things like you didn't even kind of think twice about if you've grown up with a lot of technology. Um, I know a common one that my friends will talk about is like teaching people how to convert like a document to PDF. For some people, like that's very difficult, and they're not able to understand it. So incorporating things like technology in education can kind of not only like fix that problem in the future, because I don't think very many people who grew up with technology struggle with that now, but kind of to it continue to educate kids like as they grow up, which increases the pace at which like our students are able to understand technology and kind of apply it in their day-to-day life. And digital literacy, I think, applies to a lot of different aspects of technology. I think in addition to like technical capabilities, digital literacy is very important in like how to navigate these digital spaces, how to navigate the internet, which are all very important things as more and more of our work is done online. So kind of as I talked about, it really prepares students for the digital world and future careers in technology or just kind of in general that are utilizing technology. And I think incorporating technology and education also really develops technical creativity. My little sister is still in middle school, and she'll come home and show me the different animations and things she built, whether it be like on PowerPoint or like the applications they're using in the innovation lab. And it's really showing kind of like a new type of creativity, I think, because in the past, when I was a little kid in middle school, a lot of the times I would be doing similar things, just like on like physical pieces of paper, like drawing out things in art class. But they're able to kind of do that in a digital manner, which is really exciting. They're able to kind of um, express that creativity with a new medium. And I think kind of like building off of like the digital literacy piece I was talking about earlier, I think that digital literacy is kind of defined in an ever evolving manner because of rapid technology innovation. I think in addition to like, are you able to like navigate these websites? Are you able to complete these tasks to do your work? I think also like digital literacy is like very applicable to, are you able to detect like a phishing email? Are you able to see when when a website might not be trustworthy? Are you able to do research effectively? Are you able to like piece through a Wikipedia page and see which one was contributed by someone who's maybe an expert or knowledgeable about the subject versus someone who's just kind of like doing a prank essentially? And also a lot of times, like I will, excuse me, when I'm doing research for like kind of preliminary research for a topic, I can go through and read a Wikipedia page, piece through like which pieces of information are relevant and like have been written by someone who's knowledgeable about the topic, and I'll go to the bottom where all the sources are and find a ton of articles that are related to the topic. So I kind of use it as an article like search method. So I'll do like a preliminary like read through and figure out like what's going on, and then find articles to kind of further educate me on the topic. Um, so I think like being able to navigate these digital systems is really important, especially as more and more of our information is stored online, but also as students need they need to navigate this information, as well as more information has been kind of like leaked in data leaks. You're going to be seeing like a rise in like phishing emails, like those suspicious texts. So being able to be like technically literate enough to be able to navigate those different situations, I think is really important. I'm going to go through and see if there's any more questions. Okay, going to continue. So kind of more about tech skills. I think that it really cultivates not only the skills you need for like technology, but also to kind of handle like rapidly changing job requirements. As I think machine learning is more applied to not only tech jobs, but also just like office jobs and like other like areas where like automation is possible. The job tasks of like non-technical people are also going to change, and being able to utilize those technologies will be important, and being able to kind of like ask the questions even if you're not super familiar with the technology will be incredibly important. And I think having those skills and our students will be like very, very important to be able to handle those changes with the rapid innovation. And kind of talking a little bit more about the significance of EdTech is how it has a possibility to transform education as it is right now. I talked a little bit earlier about personalized and adaptive learning. So not only are we able to kind of adapt learning to fit different people's learning styles, allow for more accessibility modifications to be made, but also really personalized learning for students that are more advanced in certain areas, maybe need additional assistance in other subjects. With ed tech, you're able to kind of have a wider variety of information and levels for the students to have. So if they're very advanced in English, for example, they're able to have materials that match their level at that, but they need a little bit more assistance and a little bit more time working through like those math lessons. You're able to have that a little bit more easily when you're using technology, because you can kind of match like where the student is at with the lesson plan and personalize it a little bit more. And kind of on a different note too, when doing maybe a school project or doing research with education technology and kind of like the vast amount of like information and resources available to us, students are able to kind of like hone in on their interest a little bit more when they're doing like a more like kind of like wide project that is maybe teaching skills about writing and like critical thinking, but they're able to learn more about like, I don't know, like the manufacturing industry, or learn more about like trains, or learn more about snakes or something like that. They're like interested in, while still kind of developing those crucial skills. And I think also education technology really enables students to explore, experiment, and problem solve a little bit more, because they have more information and also the ability to kind of connect with students globally. I think this is more relevant to older students, but I know myself when I was participating in Emily Checkthons for the first time in 2020, when almost everything was online, I was working with people from all over the world, which sometimes was a little bit logistically challenging just due to like time difference things. But I found it to be like very interesting, because I learned a lot about how different countries were handling the pandemic, as well as like how different students like learned in different educational systems. And I think that provides like a very kind of like unique piece to supplement students' educations. They're like more, I guess, knowledgeable about people who are different from them, like globally, and like different countries, different areas, even within their own country, or people just like at different schools learning different things. And I think that this kind of also brings more educational resource access globally, because we have more open source learning materials, and we're able to kind of utilize the more personalized and expansive education through technology at schools that maybe didn't have the resources to do so in the past. So Now I'm going to dive a little bit more into the state of education technology currently, kind of trends that I've noticed, as well as like current challenges and why open source can potentially be a solution to some of these challenges. So, something that's like a pretty common trend that you'll have probably seen is the adoption of LMS, learning management systems, and online courses. This was, I think, a little bit implemented before 2020, depending on like where you were. Sometimes you were submitting an assignment online, but at least in my experience, I was doing the majority of my learning in person, and I would occasionally submit a paper online, access like a documentary, some sort of like lecture online. But the majority of what I was doing was in person. And then when COVID hit, everything immediately shifted to online because a lot of people needed to quarantine during the pandemic. So that's like when I saw kind of the like variety of learning management systems. Because I was enrolled at a few different places, so different schools were using different learning management systems and like different ways of managing it. I had one teacher, for example, this is I think the funniest example, teach class from a Google Doc. So he would have us all log on at a certain point in time and then would type out the lesson plans and would like ask questions on the Google Doc. Definitely not the most efficient manner. This is an older professor, so he wasn't super technologically literate. And I found it to just be funny with like 30 of us all logged onto this Google Doc while he's like lecturing out. We're asking questions throughout it. And then, of course, we had the teachers that were more kind of like prepared to handle this, doing like, of course, like the live like Zoom lectures, or I had a few professors who would stream through Twitch or YouTube, who could ask questions that way, and everything was a little bit more polished because they had that experience. But a lot of schools in general just kind of like using things like Canvas, Moodle, Blackboard to manage their online courses. um, the Google Doc was very funny to me. I would think it would be at least like a video call, but that's how you decided to handle it for the semester. Um, kind of other like digital technology that's been implemented in education are things like smartboards, tablets, online resources, which I think like were pretty implemented in at least the schools I was at before. A lot of technology or a lot of education went online. We were utilizing online resources like videos, different articles, as well as like more of like a free research process. And I know with my mom being a teacher in the past, and I have a few family members who are currently teachers, they utilize a lot of open source curriculum to kind of help them guide what they should be implementing. Because even if someone's been a history teacher for however many years, if there's a current events piece to it, sometimes we'll need assistance in kind of getting up to date on that, and maybe using a piece of open source curriculum to kind of supplement their existing tools as well. Something that's kind of an emerging trend in EdTech is adaptive learning. So things where you're able to add more accessibility pieces, where they're maybe not integrated with previous EdTech platforms, kind of adaptive learning, and students are able to kind of customize what they're interested in, as well as just like different learning styles. Something I think that's very interesting is AI-driven assessments. I have an example about this in just a second. But also, virtual labs, I think, are an emerging trend. When I took a biology class my freshman year, our entire lab was online. Part of this because it was in 2020, but I thought it was interesting that we were doing like pill bug labs as well as like the microscope things completely virtually. So it was like all animated, kind of like a cartoon. So I felt like I was playing a video game for my lab. But I think that can be a very interesting way to teach students about different concepts when the schools either aren't able to be in person because of things like a pandemic, but also if schools just don't have the access or the funding to things like a traditional lab. I think those virtual labs can be a great way for students to learn more, and have access to some sort of like version of that lab without having like the right, or not without having the access or funding to things like that typically. Okay, so now I'm going to stop sharing my slides and share a quick demo video of an AI like driven assessment. I actually saw this at a hackathon I was at this previous weekend, where essentially the application takes in your notes. So say, for example, you have like a bunch of psych notes and you need to quiz yourself before a test. This will essentially take your notes and make it into like a quiz. It's really cool. So I'm gonna share my screen. And there's no audio on this. So if you're not hearing anything, you're not supposed to be hearing anything, but me talking. But as you can see, on the right, there are some notes. They're copying them into the application and saying, I want 2 multiple choice questions and 2 short answer questions. And once that uploads, it takes a little while because it's querying ChatGPT, I believe, to kind of create these questions. But then you can see it spits out a multiple choice quiz as well as questions. And something that I thought was interesting is I've seen things like this in the past, but these hackers were able to like have feedback built into this application, which we'll see in a second. Because a lot of times when I'm like when I'm studying for a test, like you want to have the feedback so you know like what you need to go back and kind of review a little bit more. So I found this to be very interesting and a really cool tool that can be used like in tech and in EdTech. So as you can see, they got an 8 out of 22 because the short answer were graded differently than the multiple choice. So there was like 10 points for the short answer and 1 point each for the multiple choice. But I found that to be pretty interesting. Okay, so kind of moving on past kind of like emerging trends in education technology, I want to kind of talk about the current challenges that EdTech is facing. So a big one is cost. As a lot of you may know, whether like due to experiencing this at your own school or people close to you, a lot of schools don't have the funding they need for everything. So proprietary software and solutions can be very expensive, especially when you're needing to make a solution for hundreds or thousands of students. So like that's a big challenge we're facing in EdTech, and how many of these proprietary technology solutions should a school be implementing, what needs to be prioritized. And also kind of with that comes a lock-in of if you're using a proprietary solution from like a third party, a lot of times you're going to have limited flexibility and customization. So you're not going to have all those possibilities with essentially like altering it to fit like your like students like diverse like learning needs, whether that be different learning styles, different accessibility needs, as well as just like different interests in general, or maybe different levels. I know sometimes at smaller schools you'll have a class that is technically like just like algebra 2 or something like that, but you'll have students at like varying different levels, and you of course want to have the students who maybe aren't progressing as quickly have the support they need, while not having more advanced students become bored or like not getting as much out of the class as possible. So that like lock-in with limited flexibility and customization is a big challenge, and also kind of the lock-in of if you're partnering with a proprietary tech solution, you are oftentimes locked into like a several-year contract. And sometimes like the proprietary solution will fit your needs for 1 or 2 years, but maybe your needs change and aren't aligning with the company's kind of roadmap for innovation, and you need a different solution, but you're locked into this like 5-year contract. And then also another challenge with education technology is data privacy. I think this is super, super important because with so much of education being serving children, you need to be very, I guess, cognizant about data security and ownership. With so many data leaks happening and people like third parties having access to data, I think that's very important when there are sensitive and potentially vulnerable populations such as children who are still learning about like how to navigate the digital world, as well as like just like who need to understand more about how to navigate a digital landscape where your email might get like leaked in some sort of data breach, and you'll be receiving different emails and you didn't know how to navigate those, how to discern what is real versus a scam or a phishing email. And I think also like the data privacy aspect of sensitive information, like first and last name, addresses, social security numbers within the US, which are all like very sensitive pieces of information that you don't want leaked at a school. Additionally, kind of the innovation piece is also, excuse me, an important challenge within education technology because technology as a whole innovates at like a pretty rapid pace, and your school's specific needs and like the challenges you're facing might not line up with a proprietary solution, or it might just be very unique, even to other universities, schools, or educational places. So, kind of based on like that um, piece of that, kind of dives into the need for open source. So there's kind of like a few reasons that like you can probably think of based on what I just said, why open source could be a good solution for EdTech. But open source solutions are very effective and flexible. So a lot of schools would be avoiding that high price tag that comes with proprietary pre-built software, and also they're not subject to that lock-in of you're stuck in a 5-year contract, and it's not meeting your needs anymore. You're able to customize it pretty easily. So if your educational needs change, you have a class with a lot of different people, you're able to um, change those and edit them to meet the needs of your classroom or your school as a whole. And kind of also, I think the community driven development really is a key part of this because the community could be like open source as a whole, which I think is a really cool thing, but also I think that open source community driven development could really kind of like foster an even deeper sense of community at schools or universities. If an entire department or maybe an entire school is working together on an open source education solution and they're able to kind of help each other out using their kind of vast like skill sets. Because you may have some teachers or professors who are more technologically literate and are able to kind of adapt the online open source education a little bit more, but you may have more experienced teachers who have kind of like a wider variety and just like longer experience with different students' needs. And they're able to kind of like provide insight and assistance in that way. And I think like a very big piece is the data privacy and ownership control, especially for younger students. You're able to hold more of your own data, like within the school, within the classroom, and also enforce specific data protection policies. Depending on your jurisdiction, the laws surrounding working with children or minors may vary, especially with data protection. But I know in the past, like when I've been a camp counselor or working with kids, like as a teacher, the process for that can be pretty intense and rigorous to make sure that um, like kids are protected and that kind of like all the compliance is in place. So having like your own like data privacy and ownership control of everything, I think is a really positive aspect of open source in ed tech. Okay, I'm gonna take 1 minute to go get some more water. So if you need to go get water or a snack, I'll be back in about 1 to 2 minutes. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop in the chat, and I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. I have my water. Been talking a little bit much, and my glass of water was running low, so we're back. Okay, I'm gonna go through and see if there's any questions or comments. It's like someone said that their college computer labs got Windows, but buying the activation key for a lot of computers got really expensive, and they could have saved a lot of money by using any Linux distribution like Linux Mint or Ubuntu. Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's a lot of open source technology that can be used for things like labs, as well as just like kind of like coding curriculum. I think is a big one. A lot of schools like will buy like curriculum or textbooks or other like solutions, but I think a lot of the times you're able to use open source curriculum or your own curriculum, kind of like in conjunction with online materials. I know that a few of my professors specifically in computer science don't even require any textbooks, like those outside solutions that I know some universities or classes require, because there's just like so many things online that can be used to kind of cut down that cost. And also a lot of the times they are like more up to date and make more sense. All right, so now that we've kind of dove into a little bit of the current state of education technology and challenges, let's move ahead. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about machine learning in education technology. I think this is really interesting, and I think like really pertinent with kind of like the rise of ChatGPT being used for a lot of education. I know that um, all right, okay, it looks like I did not update these slides. So I'm just going to go back here and talk about a little bit more about machine learning and EdTech. My bad for not updating the slides. But essentially, I think that with like the rise of ChatGPT in just like overall in the world, I think that there's a lot of like unique ways like that kind of technology can be used to enhance education. I know that cheating is a big concern in a lot of places for um, just like asking ChatGPT for the answers or like having it generate different like pieces of text. I think it's a little funny sometimes when I'm looking at discussion boards and you're able to very clearly see who just copied something straight from a ChatGPT prompt. But I think kind of generative AI and that kind of query based AI products really have the capability to enhance our education, because like when I've been working through bugs in the past, like before technology like this existed, you're kind of just like reading through a lot of online documentation. You're looking at Stack Overflow, but with like the new kind of like prompt based engineering, you're able to ask questions and update. And you kind of like work through that bug and that like your questions about it a little bit more seamlessly. It's not always correct, so you'll have to go back and maybe do your own research sometimes. But I found that a lot of the times it's able to point you in the right direction or kind of enhance your understanding of a certain bug and like why it does that. And if you ask it the right questions, it can definitely enhance your education. And kind of like, as we talked about earlier, kind of like the AI driven assessment, I think is a big piece too. If you want to kind of have that quizzing aspect, you're able to do it a lot quicker, I think. And then someone just said, I think no one now uses Stack Overflow. I would agree that like it's like the usage has definitely gone down as you're able to have like kind of a more interactive like debugging um, methodology, because you have those like that just like in place to ask questions. As in addition to like kind of generating like sample code, if you're curious about like a specific topic, you're able to also like ask questions about specific aspects of the function or data types and things like that. And I think kind of like outside of specifically for technology education, but just like utilizing technology more broadly in education, my friends who aren't in technology and are curious about different topics and kind of like needing to learn also are able to use ChatGPT if they prompt it correctly. One of my friends studying psychology will ask it questions about how like what questions would you ask during like this case study, like what specific aspects would you need during like a diagnostic, and also maybe like asking for um, different theories or I guess like previous instances in the past to kind of jumpstart um, like that ideation and brainstorming process for maybe a school project where you're doing a presentation and you're not able to think of different aspects. I think it's like a big time saver in finding, oh, here like is a list of like all of these different instances of case studies in like the past in psychology, and you're able to kind of like read through and do your own research on like those specific instances or ask it questions a little bit more about that. And I think it is kind of interesting too. In the past, I've been asking ChatGPT about like questions about a university or like different aspects of like I had it like make me like an itinerary for like a trip I was thinking about taking. You're able to see like where the holes are because of course it can't know like all of human knowledge. It's still like in progress and continuing to be iterated on. It will tell you, oh, I can't access that piece of information. Like the latest I was updated on this particular subject was like 2021. So you can see where ChatGPT and kind of like machine learning models as a whole like will have like those outdated or like just like missing pieces, which I think is interesting. And I like the transparency aspect too of like not just I don't know this or like this is the answer, but I think it's interesting that it's very transparent about that whole process. Okay, so that was me talking about machine learning ed tech. Sorry, the slides were not updated. Oh, okay. I see what I did. I just I had a copied version of the slide and then my actual slide. So now that I gave a very lengthy introduction, I can talk a little bit more about the applications and benefits of machine learning and ed tech, but I'll kind of breeze through this because I feel like I touched on it a little bit. Kind of like the applications of ML and tech and the personalized learning aspect. I think we really touched on this earlier, kind of with generative quizzes, as well as like making sure that students are able to have curriculum that meets where they are. And early intervention, I think, is like a pretty interesting piece too of machine learning algorithms being able to identify students that may be at risk of falling behind or who are struggling with a certain topic based on their submission data or maybe just like how often they're viewing a page. I think that's like a really interesting and key point. And for professors or teachers who have a very large student enrollment, who maybe don't have as much TA support as they need, this could be a very interesting way for professors to like make sure that students are getting the help that they need. I think that recommender systems, like we kind of touched on this a little bit, but recommending like relevant learning resources, courses, and materials to both students who are like interested in learning more about maybe natural language processing or I don't know, like the history of pop culture. That was kind of random, but and also I think it like helps the recommender systems will help teachers who are exploring curriculum, maybe a like an experienced teacher who is looking to update their curriculum from what it's been for like 15 years. They want to like add things up, or maybe just a teacher who's had their curriculum for just a year or two and looking to like add additional things as well. Automated grading is a big part. I think that's pretty implemented across the board currently. If you can see, like whether it's like on Canvas, you submit your quiz and it automatically is able to like assume it's able to see for certain answers like what's correct for just like multiple choice. That's not really machine learning. That's kind of like a piece of automated grading. But things like if it's able to piece together like is like this code like running properly, like those kind of like automated tests. Something that would be interesting is kind of the more short answer like essay based assignments need like the like automated grading through machine learning algorithms with like the quiz kind of like generator I showed earlier. I think that was a very kind of like interesting way that like that could be implemented. I don't know if that like across the board will be integrated into like actual classrooms, but the students that did create that application, the hackathon, mentioned that ChatGPT was very strict and like a little bit stringent with grading, which I found to be interesting. That like I guess it does make sense that like the algorithm would be more strict and a little bit more harsh than a professor or a teacher might be when grading. But Additionally, that might be because the application just doesn't understand language as complexly as a person does. Um, NLP, I feel like, is a pretty obvious one with things like ChatGPT, like we talked about earlier. They can really enhance language learning and also comprehension. If you're a student who needs like a lot of repetition and needs to ask a lot of questions for a concept to stick and for you to really understand it, I think that NLP models can really help you. I think another one, the same hackathon I was at, was a whole like AI track. They had an application where they were having like generative conversations for language learning. So if you were learning like Spanish or French, it would generate different topics for you to kind of talk about. And if you're like pretty beginner at like learning Spanish, like you respond back in English, like, oh, this is too advanced for me. Like, can you like I guess like simplify the language? It was able to do that as well, which I feel like is a really cool way to learn those languages if you don't have any native speakers like kind of close to you or like around you that you can like learn from. Kind of like finally, one of the applications of machine learning and technology is predictive analytics, which is kind of forecasting student performance and graduation rates. I think this is somewhat applied with kind of historical data already, forecasting student performance as well as like how many people will complete a program. I do want to, I guess, touch on this that it has a potential to be problematic or used improperly due to bad data. Um, just because, like, a lot of times, underserved students will be assumed to not be able to perform at a certain level or not be able to finish a certain program just because they're not receiving like the same support as other students. And I think that if we don't have that proper context with predictive analytics, it could like lead to those students like not receiving the proper attention and education they need, and kind of maybe exacerbating that existing problem. A little bit on the benefits of machine learning and EdTech. I think it has the possibility to improve a lot of learning outcomes. So kind of like personalizing that curriculum for like better student engagement. I know that when I was the most engaged in middle school was when I was able to utilize my writing skills to talk about the books I was reading. I was a total bookworm. I was like reading probably 100 books a year or something like that in middle school. So if I was ever able to do like school assignments on like those books I was reading outside of class, I was always like more interested and engaged in those lessons just because I found like the material to be interesting. And I think that kind of like having like a wider variety of that with like machine learning being implemented in curriculum development as well as just like overall education is a really cool benefit. I do think those data-driven insights can be helpful if used properly with like enough context. I think that they can make educators have kind of like more information to make their informed decisions on, to see like if the edits to curriculum will be helpful and kind of be able to see in real time, is this working? And also like which students need extra help, which students do I need to maybe have additional material for to maybe challenge a little bit more, that kind of thing. And I do think this can also like increase efficiency by automating administrative tasks like grading, which kind of like helps educators to focus more on teaching and connecting with their students and helping their students in any way kind of like possible to like learn more or connecting them with different resources and opportunities at their schools. So I think that's a really positive benefit of utilizing machine learning and technology, because you're able to just kind of like spend your energy in areas where maybe it'll be a little bit more appreciated. And lastly, I think early intervention with students who are struggling with a topic and allowing them to have support like a little bit more timely and a little bit quicker, so that if they are falling behind in a certain subject or they're struggling, they're able to get the help they need more quickly if they're not able to advocate for themselves. So now I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit more about like open source edtech and kind of the differences between that and proprietary edtech. We're going to kind of do like a comparison. As you can see on the left, there are different sections of things you might consider when implementing different technologies on a campus. And then I have it broken down by open source and proprietary. I'm just going to kind of go down the line as far as kind of like the benefits and drawbacks of both. If you have any questions or anything to add about kind of the benefits and drawbacks of open source and proprietary in education, feel free to drop in the chat. So as far as cost, I feel like we covered that pretty thoroughly. Open source is free or low cost, and proprietary is expensive. The customization piece, open source is very customizable to meet your specific needs, and proprietary is not. It's very vendor dependent on like third parties, the priorities of the company, etc. Collaboration. Open source is like very collaborative. It's driven by like the global community of developers and users, because without that community, it just straight up wouldn't exist. And kind of the collaboration piece at proprietary is that it's just controlled and developed by a single company, maybe a few companies if there are dependents within that technology, but it's pretty much like controlled by a single entity. The flexibility in open source is pretty flexible. You're able to adapt it to a lot of different like educational contexts. I think that the flexibility of open source has honestly more to do with like the amount of time and energy you're able to put into it more than anything, as well as your technical skill set. But I think all of those can be expanded to meet the needs of your school. And the flexibility of a proprietary EdTech platform is that it likely won't meet every single need that your school has. It will likely require like significant adjustments if you have like very specific or unique requirements. A little bit more about like maintenance, which I think is really important with technology, to not just have like kind of like a new shiny thing like every few months, but to have something that you can kind of like update and like innovate with over time. Open source has support available from the community of people who developed it, as well as like any third-party people. So like, and for instance, you don't have a very technical education staff, you could bring in developers who would kind of work on like a contract basis to assist you with that. And also like the maintenance of proprietary, I think it's like one of the like biggest benefits of going proprietary is that you'll have like that support and maintenance typically offered by the vendor. So you're able to like have that built in, like not have to think about it as much as you would with open source. The data aspect for open source versus proprietary is that you have almost complete ownership over your data and the data privacy. With open source, especially if you like build it out even more within your own system. And proprietary is just dictated by the vendor and their vendors. I think you can be more prone to data leaks that way. Then innovation in open source is pretty constant, and you're able to kind of innovate it towards how it fits your specific community, your specific educational institution, or your classroom, which I think is really cool. And also within proprietary, you don't quite have the same ability to innovate as you do in open source. There are some innovations, and they can be like really cool ones, but they typically rely on the vendor's development cycle, any goals the vendor is trying to meet, or potentially any shareholders they're trying to kind of like keep happy. Kind of a little bit more about like this comparison. The UX for open source can kind of like vary based on customer customization. If you have specific accessibility needs, or you're trying to like make it incorporate into your school's branding, that's pretty simple to do. With proprietary, it's typically a consistent, polished user experience, but it's not customized to your school. I know that some universities will like add their school logo to Canvas, but there's not much you can do besides that as far as like customizing it specifically to your school. And you can build it out a little bit, but not as much as you can with open source. But open source doesn't tend to be as overall consistent as like a very central like vendor. As far as sustainability within open source, it's less vulnerable to vendor changes. So if like you have a company that is like bought, or there's different like reorganizations within the company, or just shifting priorities, you're not going to have those same things in open source because it's sustained by the community, whether it be like the wider open source community or just like your specific school that's adjusting it. And some examples of open source technology in education are Moodle and edX. I don't personally like Moodle that much. I found it to be a little frustrating when I was using it, but I do love Open edX. And there are a lot of other educational platforms that I think run by open source that are really cool. Proprietary examples of EdTech would be Blackboard and Canvas. I don't particularly like any of these. They're all right, and I'm able to figure them out, but not, I guess, like the most intuitive or like innovative way to do education. Awesome. Looks like there's a lot going on in the chat. People answering each other's questions, dropping some links and resources. I love to see that. Someone, I think from earlier, we were talking about machine learning. I would really like it if we had more ML applications in our education system, even if our teachers want them, but it's really difficult to build and train such models. I really want to work on making them accessible to masses. That's awesome. I think that is a really cool thing to do, and I think it's going to help like a lot of students and teachers. Awesome. All right. So now we're going to have a little bit of an official intermission. I know I stepped away from y'all for a little bit earlier to grab some water because I was losing my voice a little bit, do not have any water, but now we're going to take a few minutes. You guys can grab some water, a snack, stretch a little bit, step away from your computer. I know that was a lot of information, so I'll be back in about 2 minutes. All right, everyone, I'm back. I hope you were able to please grab some water, maybe stretch a little bit. Now we're going to kind of get back into it. I'm going to go through and see if there's any questions that I missed, by the way. Okay, this is one on AI and ChatGPT within education. AI and ChatGPTs are great and all. The problem I see is that it's based on probability, and so what are the chances the next word should be A or B? This does lead to an answer that seems right most of the time, but also leads to answers that seem like they're right but are not. We have seen news reports on GPTs giving advice and answers that lead to real-world consequences, like judges using it to give sentences and lawyers using it to give case law that doesn't exist. I think this is a really important thing to consider when implementing like artificial intelligence into education. But I think that's also kind of like why using something like ChatGPT or GPT in general, it's important to go back and verify things when you're doing research or like when you're like using it to help you like write or learn things, that you need to go back and verify things, even if it seems like a little bit off or like you're just like a little bit curious to go through and investigate it. When I was using ChatGPT one time to see if it could like solve some like math problems, it was confidently telling me that 2 + 2 was 5. This was a few months ago. So like I've hoped it's like improved since then. But there are things like that where it's like so blatantly wrong, and like presents it confidently. So you definitely do need to be careful. And I think that kind of like having like machine learning audits is a way that we can kind of like move to a way where things like this are more reliable. But definitely something we need to consider as we use like kind of emerging technology within our education. Okay. Someone said we should think of using ML models, not generative AIs for teaching. I think that's a very good point. And kind of just to use like generative AI kind of as like supplementary or something like you're kind of like just like experimenting with versus like this is the curriculum. And this is something like we're like presenting like in a lecture, but something like we kind of use to experiment with together as a whole. Someone said audits is where open source comes in. I totally agree with this. I think that open source generative AI is kind of like a way that we will, I guess, like be able to audit and like look through things a little bit more because everything is more transparent. You're able to look through the code and how that model was trained and what data it was being trained with. Awesome. So I'm gonna kind of get into the next slide so we can kind of continue along. Um, so now I'm going to talk about implementing open source education technology. Um, there's kind of like a three-step process for this. So the first step is to kind of like assess your current institution, your current school, your current university, department, et cetera's like your unique educational needs. Because like a fifth grade math class is going to have very different needs from like a 500 person like calculus lecture versus like an entire university or maybe like a 200 person very small school. Um, and kind of like what you can do during this like initial assessment and analysis, you need to really identify areas where open source technology can make a difference because there might be like a lot of problems or areas where you need attention in your current education or EdTech space, but where specifically can open source make a difference? Where do you have the bandwidth and where are you able to kind of like implement that open source technology in a way that makes sense? If your school is tight on budget, it might make sense to use a Linux distribution versus like having like Windows licensing for all the computers. And then you're able to use that money you saved by implementing open source to maybe pay for different ed tech solutions that you don't have the time to implement. And also, I think a very key factor is to consider how ready is your staff or your students for this transition. So if you're like not already using a lot of ed tech, you're not already using a lot of open source in your education space, you need to make sure that you have those additional resources, that support for staff that maybe isn't as technologically literate, so needs a little bit more resources, a little bit more support throughout this process. And also the students, like, are the students prepared to handle this? Have they had like a lot of previous experience with technology, or do they need kind of like more guidance and more lessons specifically on how to use this technology before we implement it into our like math or science lectures, or reuse it for English or something like that. Kind of like after you've done your initial assessment analysis, you've decided on which areas you're able to implement open source technology where maybe you'll need a proprietary solution, or maybe you're just going to use like a more, I guess, like outdated offline approach in some aspects too, which I think are all good things. It's just kind of deciding what your organization can handle. And after this, it's kind of choosing which specific open source solution is right for you. So if Linux is right for you, then I'd to select that. If you want to use something like an edX type platform, or you're wanting to implement some open source coding curriculum because none of your professors or teachers at the university have experience with coding. I guess I'm more like talking about like high school or middle schools where there isn't as much like computer science education. I would hope that in a computer science department, all the professors are technologically literate. And kind of customizing that technology to align with your current curriculum, because it doesn't make sense to implement a bunch of open source technology or technology in general if it doesn't kind of meet the needs of the benchmarks you're trying to teach to students and the outcomes you're trying to achieve. So if your state or your governing institution is requiring certain things be taught to students at a certain age, and these open source curriculum aspects of these open source technologies don't support or augment like those needs in the curriculum, it doesn't necessarily make sense to integrate that. Once you've like kind of like um, decided on which specific tools you want to use, you're going to start to integrate those. Um, and you're going to kind of need to prepare to how you're going to integrate that into your existing ecosystem and kind of like anticipate any challenges. One thing like I would think of if I was implementing this at a school is kind of like before starting to implement them, creating like that curriculum for your students and teachers of like how to use the technology to begin with, and having people who are like thoroughly trained on it so they're able to answer questions as they come up and during like the first presentation, to kind of talk about it with them. I think a big aspect of this, like after you have that material, is to kind of like then just like start training your staff, training your students, as well as like providing support, because for some people this can be a big challenge. Even if it is exciting, it's still an adjustment. You'll need to do a little bit of work to kind of get everyone up to speed. So I think that providing comprehensive training for those educators, and not only why, like not only how we're implementing this, but like why we're in like implementing this open source technology, why it matters, why it's important, and also like what it's going to achieve. Like what have we seen this open source technology do at other schools? What benefits has it had in other classrooms? And I think then people who may be a little bit challenged with it will see more of a reason to kind of dive into it and really try and make it work in their classroom. I think having IT staff or people that are just like trained thoroughly on it is really important to have during this kind of like implementation process. And I think that having like those support systems built in is also a very crucial piece for both like the technical aspects, but also like for pedagogy, which I think is like very important in education, to have a pedagogy of your classroom and kind of how technology can augment an existing one, or maybe a classroom decides that after implementing a lot of open source technology, they'd like to move into a more like a different pedagogical kind of like approach in their classroom, which is all important, but needs to be kind of like properly thought out and have the support needed for those challenges. Because I think a lot of students, once so much of learning went online, like in 2020, didn't have like the proper support and fell behind just due to not having those resources in place, which is really unfortunate that those students like weren't getting their needs met. But I think that kind of having both the resources in place to begin with, but also that support are like ways that you can kind of prevent that as much as possible. And I think that kind of finally in this like training and support implementation aspect is encouraging a lot of like continuous learning within the culture to kind of continually improve your educators, your teachers' technical knowledge, as well as like how they would like adapt to like the changing educational environment. I think that's really important to kind of like have like that community in place for your teachers and your students. Someone says that I think every problem in the real, I'm gonna assume that real world can become an open source project. I agree. I think there's like a lot of different areas that can be solved with open source technology. Um, and then there seems to be people sharing a lot of links and resources, which is awesome. Someone said 10% of our students during lockdown didn't have access to a computer and internet outside of school. I think this is a very important piece when talking about implementing technology in education, um, because like the access part of it is like such a big piece, because you can't implement open source technology if you don't have access to the technology to begin with. So I think like this is another really important aspect we need to be thinking about when implementing open source tech and just like ed tech in general to our schools is, do the schools have the capability or the resources to support it? And if not, how can we kind of get those resources and that support to that school? All right. So now we're going to have to talk about like overcoming the challenges and ensuring success when talking about open source technology in education and kind of like ed tech in general. Kind of like I talked about earlier, some of the common challenges can be overcome by addressing like any resistance you may have to switching over to just ed tech in general, or maybe switching from proprietary tech to more open source, is that you're going to have to like showcase the benefits like ahead of time. So like not just like we're making these changes, but we're making these changes because we found a lot of success in other classrooms, or we're making this change because it's going to save us a lot of money in implementation, and we can use that for other areas where our students can be like better served. Um, and also making sure that there are like a lot of just like the infrastructure to answer like open source like questions and like provide those solutions to problems. And I think finally, kind of like a big challenge that you need to be prepared for is the software updates and security patches. With open source being community driven, there are going to be like frequent updates. And I think like staying up to date with those different updates, and as well as making sure that all security vulnerabilities are addressed, is really important in open source. And then also, data privacy, I think, is a really important aspect of implementing open source, because if you're implementing at a school, kind of like we talked about earlier, ensuring that those vulnerable populations are protected. So you need to establish clear data privacy policies and guidelines in implementing a very, very robust security measure to protect both student and institution data. I don't know if y'all have seen, but pretty recently in the news, there was a lot of universities in the US that had a data breach of student data, which is like not something you want like just kind of like floating out there, especially for students who might be younger, or students within the US who have their FERPA status locked, which is a law that kind of prevents your data from being sent out to other people without your consent. So that is something I think that is very important to make sure that the security is in place to um, like essentially protect. And this, like kind of like I alluded to earlier, ensuring the compliance with any data protection regulations. So ensuring that your system can enforce FERPA and other educational data protection regulations. And also, something I think is key to consider when implementing open source technology is to measure the success of your implementation. So, kind of like define what performance indicators you want for your implementation. Like, how can you measure if this is working for the students and the teachers? And I think that like how you can do that is not only having those indicators, but also to regularly see what the impact is on like the learning outcomes. Are students getting better at these different benchmarks? Are we saving the amount of money we like thought we would, and we needed to save? Like, does this still make sense? And also, how satisfied are the teachers and the students with the implementation? Are they frustrated, or are they really enjoying the new technology being implemented into their schools? And I think user feedback is really key in the beginning processes of this, to have like those sessions where you ask your educators, how are you noticing this in your classroom? How is it working? As well as how do the students like it? Are they more engaged? Are they enjoying their learning experience more? Or is the new technology making it frustrating to learn those like kind of like typical subjects you learn in school? And finally, kind of like looking into kind of like how you can scale up your open source or just kind of like ed tech implementation in general. So you need to be able to scale your application as your enrollment grows. I know some schools will kind of like ebb and flow with their enrollment, some kind of stay consistent, and some schools are like rapidly growing. So you need to be prepared to handle that as your enrollment grows, as you maybe take on more teachers to implement all of that into practice. And also, I think that like sharing those success stories as they happen in real time is really helpful. If I think teachers are able to see their peers implementing it successfully, and seeing students that maybe they've taught in the past or just like know from around school are feeling like more engaged and inspired by using things like open source in education, this will encourage people to really implement into their own classrooms. And I think that collaborating with other schools is also a way to kind of like show those like success stories and any ways to maybe potentially get over the hurdles on those challenges, because you're able to kind of bring together all of your experiences and see if maybe one teacher has a solution to a problem you're coming up with, or how specifically different schools are implementing it, and maybe give you ideas for how to use it in your classroom. So now we're going to kind of jump into a case study, but not before I look through and see what y'all have been talking about, because I've been seeing the chat be pretty active. Okay, someone said that many states and districts have strict requirements regarding the operating systems and email client for their area. Microsoft still has a monopoly. I think this is a really important thing to consider when starting to implement open source technology into schools, is seeing like what requirements are in place, what schools have existing contracts with proprietary solutions, like they're just like not able to implement open source for a while, and also seeing maybe how we can change that in the future if these solutions make more sense for our school to use open source versus whatever is like currently required. Someone was explaining the difference, the misconception about open source. It's not free, but of course, will be like the implementation won't be as costly as proprietary, and there's a lot of other benefits we kind of talked about. Yes, and also the maintainers and like the cost of making the software is something we do need to consider in open source. Someone says that they think that government fundings for schools can help to fund open source schooling. This is also a good point, that we can use kind of the existing funding and funnel it into areas that will be a little bit more innovative, or like make more sense for our schools. Someone says that in Canada, they have very strict regulations on the open source and free options. That's interesting to note. I'd be curious to see kind of like a comparison of the open source regulations from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, kind of like how that changes, especially within education. So now I'm going to kind of talk about open source in education. I have a case study of an example of implementing this. I'm going to pull up the case study on a separate tab for myself. I made the text a little bit too small for the background challenges and results for me to read. And I will fix that after the fact. So if you're looking to download the slides, that should be fixed. So our first case study here is implementing open source virtual labs. This is something that I kind of experienced when I had my virtual biology lab. It was kind of like a video game. But a little bit of background in this particular instance is a university is in the midst of an embezzlement scandal, so funding is very tight, and they're facing resource constraints in providing hands-on lab experiences for science and engineering students. So due to this embezzlement scandal, they're very tight on funds and also being very strict about who has access to the lab and who has access to funding, because they had a professor who was embezzling money who has since been removed from the university in this hypothetical situation. And kind of like the challenges this university and these professors will face when implementing these open source virtual labs is the limited budget for physical lab equipment, because they're still kind of recovering from that embezzlement scandal and the limited funding, as well as just like the additional kind of like compliance that they have to go through now that they didn't have to in the past. And now because of the past, student access to the lab is now restricted. They're kind of taking every precaution necessary to ensure that the resources are being used properly and they don't have a repeat of the past. And the third challenge that like I am seeing here is that there's a need for practical learning experiences to enhance education, because you need to have the biology labs in addition to the lectures, as well as like reading textbooks. So you need to be able to go in to get hands-on experience, whether that be with dissection or different like labs as well. So having this open source virtual lab be implemented for all the freshman biology students results in a significantly reduced cost compared to setting up the physical labs. They're able to work within their temporarily constrained budget. And it also increases accessibility and flexibility for their students. So in the past, like when you had just the strictly in-person labs, It was more difficult for students who were living off campus um, or who maybe had additional accessibility needs to participate in these labs. So these online open source virtual labs will allow for kind of increased access and learning for those students. And also, because we have this kind of interactive piece that wouldn't have been possible this semester without the virtual labs, we're going to have better student outcomes and student engagement because we have this piece, even if it wasn't what it was in the past and isn't perfect, it's still going to enhance learning outside of lecture and textbook for the students. Another thing that professors can do in this instance kind of create and share experiences, which like will foster that collaboration among educators. So they're able to see based on like how their students are reacting, what they would do differently in the future, and maybe how they could implement this in a virtual class, or maybe for a university who just normally doesn't have that much funding and isn't just facing an embezzlement scandal, that they're able to like implement these types of things into online classes or just classes where they don't have the same lab resources. Okay, so that was a lot of information. So I'm going to go through the chat. Um, yes. Virtual biology lab. Yes, I have actually done a virtual biology lab in the past, believe it or not, where we were dissecting things in like a animation or viewing things through a microscope, or we had like little pill bugs in like a petri dish, which isn't ideal, but is better than not having any lab at all. Okay, so kind of the first questions I have based on this case study I just walked through is, can anyone think of additional challenges that the professors or students might be facing in this scenario? Okay, someone said an additional challenge I see is students having a say in what goes in the curriculum. Even though the curriculum is open source, knowing how schools tend to be when it comes to listening to students, I feel like they would only grant access to teachers. I think this is a really important thing to think about and something that like should be altered, even if it will take some time with like existing department and institution politics. Especially, I think at like the collegiate level with students who are doing their own research, are like kind of like learning more about the topic themselves, are able to make those contributions into that open source curriculum. Um, and I think that like, students should definitely have a say in these open source curriculums because then they're able to kind of like better shape their learning and talk about like what is actually working for them, what is making the information click for them and their peers. Someone saying that the one-on-one interaction with students during class time could be a challenge. I think this is a very good point because typically labs are smaller classes and you're able to ask more questions to the professor or the proctor of this lab, and this won't be the case if you're doing an online virtual lab. You might be able to ask a professor or TA questions asynchronously, or maybe if the lecture is in person, you could ask them afterwards, but you won't have, I guess, that like one-on-one time in real time. Yeah. I'm curious if any of y'all have ideas, like different ideas for solving this specific challenge with open source EdTech, because like they don't have the funding essentially to do in-person labs. And also, I'm just going to kind of like read through the rest of the questions I have for this case study because we're starting to get further into the stream. So I'm curious if y'all have any additional questions about the problem and the solution. And are there any details y'all think need to be considered when implementing open source virtual labs? Like what details can you think of in this case study that might need to be added, maybe were overlooked in the process of it? Someone said with conversations surrounding the digital tech divide in the US, students might not be able to access the tech. This is another very important piece. And I think that universities can overcome this a little bit more easily than like the like secondary schools or middle schools. I know like a lot of universities have laptop lending programs or computer labs where it might be a little bit difficult for students to get into the lab itself, but at least it provides somewhat of an option. And I think that um, providing as many of like resources to kind of bridge that digital divide will like definitely be like a consideration when implementing more and more things online. And we definitely saw that kind of like taking place when so much learning went online in 2020. Students that were like just didn't have like the same resources or access to technology weren't able to keep up with their education because they just straight up could not go in person. Um, all right. Um, are there any more questions or like contributions related to case study one? Okay. Someone said it was a good case study, thought provoking. I think these are like interesting problems to consider as we talk about implementing open source in education. So, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to have a case study that has background and challenges, and I'm going to have y'all kind of crowdsource a potential solution and what you think the results of that solution would be. So, I have some questions on the right. We'll get into those in a second. But first, I'm going to give you some background on this case study. So, a school district in a large metropolitan area is faced with challenges about the cost and scalability of their proprietary learning management system. So, think, for example, just like a school in a large city where maybe the population in the city is growing. They've seen an influx in that school district. So, just their existing learning management system that's made by a third party vendor is not as scalable as I would have hoped. And they're having challenges kind of meeting the needs of all those students. So kind of the first challenge that we see here is a lot of budget constraints due to like the growing school environment. They don't have that much of an additional budget, but they have a lot more extra students, so it just is not stretching the same way it used to. And due to this being a proprietary solution and maybe also due to budgets, they're not able to get the kind of support and customization they need from that vendor. They're finding them to be inadequate for their current school needs. The third challenge is with a larger number of students coming in, they're very concerned about being locked into a long contract if potentially in the future their school district enrollment declines again, or if just they have different needs in the future and they're locked into like a 5 year long contract. They're also very concerned about data privacy because a school has so many students and they're really concerned about making sure that their students' data is properly protected. So kind of first, for everyone to kind of like we're gonna do like a crowdsource solution for this one. The first question I'm going to ask is, what additional questions do you have about the problem? What do you need to prioritize in the solution? What do you see as like the most pressing issue based on the background and the challenges we saw? And also, do any specific open source technologies come to mind as a solution for this case study? Um, Someone asked what vendor lock-in was in reference to my slides. This is essentially when you're locked into a specific vendor or third party for their solution. So, say for example, if you sign a 5 year contract with like a platform like Blackboard or Canvas, and after 2.5 years, this application is just not working for your university, your classroom, and like you're not able to use it the way you used to, but you still have to pay for it for the additional 2.5 years while this solution just is not working for you anymore. Um, Someone said that a possible solution was to implement an open source learning management system like Canva or use open educational resources. I think this is definitely a good solution. I think it will be like a good amount of additional work, but I think this is one of the most, I guess, like one of the solutions that comes to mind the easiest. Google Classroom is a free educational is free to all educational institutions and students. I think this is also a good kind of solution as well because you're able to set that up and scale it with your students. Um, Someone's asking, what kind of support are they looking for? I would assume in a specific situation that the kind of support they're looking for is just assistance and like increasing the number of students and teachers they're expecting, as well as just like having the right support to scale it to that level. Maybe they're concerned about it not having just like all the resources they need, not being able to scale it to their increased enrollment. And with an increased enrollment, there's also going to be other concerns that the school is facing outside of their technology, whether it be the physical classroom space, the number of teachers with like such a teacher shortage right now, they might be having trouble getting enough teachers in. So maybe the constraints, the support they're looking for in that instance would be to scale a specific class, like while it's still like one teacher teaching it. Right. Are there any other potential solutions or any like answers to these questions? Like any additional questions about the problems? Like, what do you think needs to be prioritized? Um, Someone says that um, the Google Classroom solution only works with high schools because students need to be at least 13 to get an email address. This is a very good point, and I think something that needs to be considered when you're looking for solutions for younger populations. Um, Train the students to scale the ecosystem with no access to sensitive data. This is definitely a unique idea. I think it could potentially work with older students if I guess like there's like proper I guess security surrounding sensitive data, as well as like very I guess like specified requirements for those students. Potentially, it could be like a independent or like smaller class with students who are interested in learning more about technology or like education as a whole, where they could get credit, I guess, for assistance in scaling the ecosystem. Um, Someone said there are concerns about data privacy in Google Classroom, which is causing it to lose popularity. That's definitely something that's very important to consider when working with students. Um, Someone said that the email is not true because you are using an internal intranet for elementary schools. This makes sense. Um, I know in the past, I my little sister when she was younger than 13 was using an email through school, so I'm assuming that's how she had access to different things like Google Classroom and other educational tools. Um, Okay, someone's curious how training the students to kind of scale the ecosystem would work. I don't think that that solution would work in an elementary school. I'm thinking that would honestly mainly just work in middle school, potentially high school. I feel like is the area where that makes the most sense for students who are more technologically literate or advanced are able to kind of scale that. I don't see that working too well in elementary school, but potentially you could have within the same district the high school students who are in this kind of independent or small group class scale the ecosystem at the elementary school as well if they're kind of seeing this issue at like a district wide as a district wide problem. Okay, I'm going to move on to questions about the results. So I'm curious about like what specific results do you think need to be targeted when implementing these solutions? How can you achieve those results? And how quickly do you need to achieve your results? In this case, like, are you looking for it to be completely scaled by the time school starts? I feel like that's a pretty, I guess, like hard stop for deadlines. It really shows like a time sensitive nature of this issue. And also, how can you measure your results and your success? How can you see are these like additional students being served essentially? There are some more questions too at the bottom that we can dive into as well. If no one has things to add about the results, I'll give it like a minute or two for y'all to type out your answers. Okay, someone says that The results could be the teacher satisfaction rate. I think that's a good metric. I think also um, how stressed and how much work are the teachers doing? Is it consistent with previous years? Are they just a little bit more stressed because of like the additional enrollment, or are they feeling a large amount of stress compared to previous years because of this new implementation and such a large enrollment in students? And also, like, what results are they seeing in the classroom? All right. I'm gonna ask, I guess, like just like one more question before I move on to the other slides, so we can get through everything before the end of our 2 hours. But I'm curious if y'all are thinking of any other problems in education you think open source could solve, and if there's any areas where you think that open source, like you see it shaping the future of education, or you want it to shape the future of education. Okay. We have another answer earlier to results. Ease of use for students. I think this is important. We don't want a bunch of extra hurdles for students to go over when they're just trying to learn like how to do basic algebra, or if they're trying to learn, I don't know, about the mitochondria or something else that's like relatively elementary. Right. If y'all have any like potential problems in education you want to see open source solve, or kind of like how you want to see it shape the future, feel free to drop those in chat. But I'm going to move ahead into kind of the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, or any like thoughts on the case studies, drop those in the chat as well. Um, Someone says that one aspect I see open source helping is curriculum development. I completely agree. I think that developing curriculum, especially for younger students, like where they need more guidance, is very challenging with things changing fast. So I think that open source is like a great way to help curriculum development. I have seen teachers in the past kind of use that as a way to supplement their existing curriculum, or for new teachers to help kind of like build out their curriculum that they'll build on for years to come. Especially in the humanities, I think is important too, to kind of like implement like a like easier, like more robust curriculum development. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, for things like history or government, I think current events is a very crucial piece of those classes. So having open source and like whether it be videos, assignments, or like other pieces that other educators have built, and you can kind of incorporate that into your existing curriculum, is I think a very like interesting use of open source. Someone else said open source helps a lot in getting to know about the opportunities as well as which good projects are taking place in any stack. I think this is definitely a really good point, especially for specifically technology education, because you're able to learn by doing and able to kind of see your results in real time and how you're contributing to a project, as well as if you're learning to get better at Python or another language, you're able to kind of jump in and see the direct applications, and have like feedback from other people in the open source community. Someone says that in the literature realm of open source curriculum development, they can see open source bringing in more diverse narratives, which is something not often done. I think this is a really good point, to kind of bring in like a greater variety of voices of authors that haven't been traditionally taught in the past, but can definitely help students like connect better to the material, have like feel more connected with these narratives that are being brought in, or just kind of bring like a greater, more enriching education experience, because it isn't like a monolith or very kind of like homogeneous within like your like literature and the pieces you're using. Someone said you demoed a Quizlet application using generative AI. Was that a recorded video, or do you have the link to the Quizlet app? That was a recorded video. It was a project that I saw this past weekend at a hackathon I was at. I don't have a link to the actual application because it isn't hosted yet. I talked to the hackers that built it this past week, and I don't think it's quite ready for people to be using on like the day-to-day basis. But I do have a link to the GitHub repo if you're like curious about learning more about the code with the people that made that. It is on the slides. So I'll be showing the bit.ly link at the end, and you can access it through the slides, if that makes sense. I was at Hackwash U. It was a really cool event. They had a ton of really interesting projects, and the AI track had just like a ton of really cool projects. I talked about the language learning one, where you're able to kind of like use generative AI to help you learn different languages and kind of like adjust that to your like level. Yes, there was also a really cool project where they had like it wasn't artificial intelligence, but a website where swim coaches were able to generate the splits for their swimmers, which I have heard it takes a very long time. It was built by two people who are on the swim team to save their coach some time just by like having that formula to generate everything. Yes. Awesome. If there aren't any more questions, I'm going to move ahead to my last slide, which is some resources. I know there's a ton of information about EdTech in general because it's such a like just wide variety of information. It's a huge area because like everyone needs to learn. So on the left, I have some information on EdTech as a whole, kind of the history of EdTech, the benefits of massive online open courses, which is kind of similar to it's like an open source version of education, open source courses. There's more about like the online course revolution within EdTech, as well as some existing EdTech trends in the 21st century. And then on the right, I have some more information about open source. Some are more specific to education. As you can see, there's a Journal of Open Source Education, but some are about like contributing to open source if you're curious about learning more about that, and kind of like the challenges of implementing open source in education. Yes, okay. All right. Thank you to everyone who came out to this open source and education stream. It was great to see so many people in chat asking a bunch of questions. If you're curious about like learning more, you can go back to those resources. And if you want to go back and access these slides, you can go to this bit.ly link where I have shared my Canva page. Just as a note, I have it set to view only. So if you request additional access, I won't be granting that, so my slides don't get altered, but you're able to view everything, click on the links throughout this as well. So if you're curious in checking out that Quizlet demo, you can click on the link in the slide, as well as the resources have links to those as well. Thank you to everyone for coming out so much. And I hope to see you at other Global Hack Week events this week. I'm going to end the stream as I'm going to do today in Global Hack Week in just a few minutes, but I'll see y'all there. Thank you.